Welcome to the Stanfords Travel Podcast. Mapping your travels since 1853, Stanfords is the world-famous independent map and travel bookshop based in London's Covent Garden. Thank you for joining us on this little podcast adventure.
It's a great honour to be able to welcome to the stage, in conversation with Simon Lister, please welcome Sir Trevor McDonald.
Thanks very much, Sir Trevor. It's a great pleasure to be with you here today.
Thank you. Thank you.
You were in my living room a lot as a child, but it's wonderful to see you in the flesh for the first time. Let's start, not at the beginning, but almost at the beginning. You were born in Trinidad in 1939. You beat the start of the Second World War by about 3 weeks, not the First World War.
Yes, and that's lucky. Yes.
Yeah, and Trinidad was an interesting place because if we go on a couple of years, it was still a British colony. You grew up in a colonial island, but Trinidad was changing fast.
It was changing, but it's difficult to emphasize too much how much of a colonial place it was. We all looked to London. We talked more about Trafalgar Square and Nelson and the few who did so much for so many, and about the fact that Francis Drake played bowls on Plymouth Sound before going out to hunt the Armada. We looked to London as the mother country, and in a way that doesn't really emphasize how much it played in our lives, in our cultural lives and everything else. It was all centered on the mother country.
And when was it? I mean, your wonderful book is about your life and your life with cricket. When was it that cricket first hit you between the eyes and you fell in love with it or thought, I will fall in love with this?
Probably from the moment I was born. Because it was looking back at it now, and I look back at it now, with a little more, retrospective view. I mean, it was everything. It was what we played. It was what you dreamt of doing. You heard about the names of great cricketers. You heard about, how the West Indies team was doing. I remember somebody saying to me, working in an office, when the West Indies played anywhere, suddenly everybody spouted airphones. Everybody came in with peace. Everybody had secret radios and so on. Almost no work got done because people were listening to the cricket. So it very much part of our lives, really.
Why was that? Why did cricket have such a profound effect on so many people across the Caribbean?
It's very, very difficult to say why that was. But the point was, you were told from being a child, things like play up and play the game, and you didn't know what does that mean. You can't. Remember Gary Sobers saying once, he said, if you are batting and you touch the ball and you're caught behind and you don't walk, you're a cheat. And C.L.R. James, a Western Trinidadian writer, said, it's all right to cheat the taxman or to cheat the government, but you can't cheat at cricket. Somehow cricket became, a symbol of something which was almost as important as life itself. And I've always wondered, why that was so, because, cricket is played in India and Pakistan with the same degree of insanity as is done in the West Indies. I remember going up on the border with Afghanistan and Pakistan and seeing kids in the dust playing, right on the border there with Afghanistan, and kids in the, playing cricket. But yet in the West Indies it became much more profound as a part of our culture.
And when you were a boy, it was your relationship with the family wireless, the radio set. You write about that it probably it drew out your love of cricket, but also your love of world affairs, and you were introduced to the world through that radio set.
And language and everything else. Yes, I watched, and I remember my father bought the first radio my father was persuaded to buy, was because when West Indies played Australia, I would go to a neighbor, and because of the time difference, and I forget exactly how it worked out now, but I was coming back home much too late, and I wasn't going to get my homework done. And so my father thought the one way of stopping me doing this and venturing out at night to listen to cricket in a neighbor's house late at night somewhere, he should buy a radio. So we bought one of those things with a huge battery, I remember, and it was because, I was so absorbed with and as you say, not only cricket, but, I was interested in the world, because the point of view that, and I now reflect on that now, these islands, the West Indies Islands, are tiny, tiny, tiny places. When I left Trinidad, I don't think the population was 1 million. You hear a lot about Barbados. I don't think today the population of Barbados is 720,000 or something. They're tiny, tiny, tiny places. And so we look outwards. And one of the things is we look to where people were playing cricket.
And your broadcasting career began in your own school.
Yes. This was a bit of a cheat on my part, really. I think it was a double math period on Friday, which I hated. And so I convinced one of my tutors that I could broadcast on the public address system in the school some news reports on Friday afternoon. And I would listen to the World Service or the BBC somewhere, copy it down, and on Friday afternoon, instead of doing double math, I would tell the kids about what was going on around the world. So, yeah, it was a way of, I don't think they ever found out that I was cheating, but I managed to get away with it.
Let's talk about 1950 for a moment. You were 11, and an extraordinary thing happened because the West Indies won a cricket series in England, in the mother country, for the first time, and that had a huge effect, much beyond the boundary.
I mean, it was a most amazing thing. The West Indies beat England in 1950 for the first time. Ramadan and Valentine were the two spin bowlers who helped accomplish this. And it had a profound effect on Trinidadian life. And I mean, it had a cultural effect, but it also had a political effect. I remember a man who was running to be the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, Eric Williams, said, "If we can beat the mother country at cricket, we can govern ourselves." Now that was, I thought, looking back at it now, that was palpable nonsense. But as a political slogan, it wasn't a bad one, and he got away with it. And that also led to the calls that, there used to be only white captains of the West Indies teams before then. And then there became a movement to say, why don't we have a West Indian captain? And there was a big political movement about this, a big cultural movement about this, and it was accomplished.
I mean, people might be surprised to know that until 1960, you had a largely black West Indian cricket team led by a white man. Can you just explain why that was?
Yes, well, I mean, I to be very honest, I can't explain how that happened really, but that's the way it was. It was what was taken for granted. But then, as I say, after 1950, it all began to change. And there were big kind of cultural and political movements about having our own West Indian captains being West Indians, being black West Indians. It was extraordinary.
And was that important to you? Was it a greater sense of representation that the cricket team was led?
When it was mentioned, nobody paid any attention to it very much. But when it was mentioned, then people began to say, yes, why is that? Why why do we not have a black West Indian captain? And that movement spread, and I mean, it began to assume a cultural force. As I say, I think Eric Williams got away with saying, if we can beat the mother country, we can govern ourselves as well.
And that first black captain was Frank Worrell, who
Yeah.
you had the pleasure of meeting, and he was one of the heroes, one of the 3 W's
He
of
was
that.
a great man. Not only was he a great player, but he was a great figure. He was a man who was, we thought pretty well educated, who talked well, and and he played so brilliantly. He was a really, really great man.
Let's talk about your journalistic career for a little while. When did the first seeds of that sprout? What was your ambition? How did it all come about?
I suppose, Simon, it began, as we were saying earlier, with being born in a tiny, tiny part of the world. But if you are born in that part of the world, you are not by nature very introspective. You look outward. And so people in these tiny, tiny islands look outward. My way of doing that was listening to the World Service of the BBC. And you heard, not only news of different parts of the world that you didn't know about and you only saw in geography books, but you heard about what was going on. I was also particularly interested in the fact that there were people who were doing the job of going around interviewing presidents and diplomats and leaders of countries and so on. And it did occur to me that they were, being assigned to do these things. They were being paid to do it, probably. Reasonably well, I thought. They were being put up in rather nice hotels, I suppose, to do this. And they got a chance to converse with these prime ministers and senior politicians and so on. And they somehow made a job of this. And I thought, this is not a bad, if I could get my hands on this thing, this is not a bad way of living, really. It's something I would really like to do. And I kind of got away with it, really. One of the things I've reflected on was that my parents were very, very, rigorous about the fact that we had to have a very good education and so on. And as I was saying to you earlier, my father would walk around and he would say, "Oh, that's Mr. Smith. His son is studying medicine in Edinburgh." Or that's, Mr. John, who his daughter is at Oxford and she's studying law. And we were constantly pointed to these figures who were doing interesting things around the world. And so, we looked outward. And I managed to get away with it by saying to people, I wanted to go around the world doing these things. And somehow they let me get away with it for a long time. So
it was very interesting that you say in your book that there were also people local people who you had to be kept away from, people who were less desirable, but cricket subverted that. So,
yes, I mean, this was one of the things about cricket. West Indian parents of my generation were very kind of famous for saying, "Oh, that guy, you must not have anything to do with him. He's in and out of prison, or he's been caught stealing, or he's, not a very desirable member of society, and you must beware of people like that." And C.L.R. James, Trinidadian author, said, but there were some of these people who, despite the fact that they had a disreputable character, could play cricket. And he describes how some West Indian mothers who would tell their kids, have nothing to do with this man, would, on a Saturday afternoon, pull the curtains back to watch him bat. Because although he was an undesirable character, he could play cricket, and he could play cricket well. And the man that C.L.R. James mentions, he said, people would do this to say because Matthew Bondman could bat. And so somehow cricket transcended everything else about people's character. If you played cricket well, then you were accepted as a good member of the crowd and a good member of society. And that's, I think about it now as a way that cricket, and I was saying to you earlier on, I remember, my mother, who I don't think ever went to a cricket ground at all, much too busy bringing up 4 kids. But I was once, in one of my many times in the Middle East, and I was in Beirut when it was, a very difficult place to be. And whenever I was in a dangerous part of the world, I'd always call my mother and pretend, in fact, it was quite quiet. And she had nothing to worry about, and there was no war here at all, despite what she heard. And I called my mother to say, Mum, I'm in Beirut, and I was about to give my excuse about how quiet the place is and nothing happens here, which was entirely untrue. And she said, I just said, Mum, I'm in Beirut, and she said, but how could the West Indies do that? And I said, I'm sorry, what do you mean? And the West Indies had lost to India at Lord's in a World Cricket match. And my mother's concern was not about my safety in Beirut, but was about the fact that the West Indies had lost to India at Lord's. And I always remember that because I was so, I was so concerned about. My parents knew I was a card-carrying coward, and they were worried about my going to these places with guns and bombs and so on. I never told them. I always ran whenever those things went off, and I kept far from the noise of battle. But my mother's concern was that the West Indies had lost to India, and it was for me always a memory of what cricket meant.
And your mum probably helped you on your way journalistically because she insisted on good diction and clarity of language.
Oh, one of the things is my parents, who were not formally educated, absolutely insisted about our doing everything by the book. Again, speak proper English. If we ever slipped into West Indian slang, my mother would say, and what does that mean? We were not allowed, I don't think I was ever in my mother's presence allowed to be West Indian as I could be with my friends when she was out of my hearing. But I think it was absolutely wonderful that I got this grounding, because out of that, I developed a fondness for the language, for literature. We were made under palm trees outside, 30 or 40 kids, to recite Byron and Tennyson and Shakespeare. I always thought anybody passing by listening to these kids saying they must wonder what the hell's going on. This is how we were brought up. And the same thing happened when you went to school. And you were, thoroughly educated in the language and its origins. I remember once having done, enough of Virgil and Homer and so on. I once tried in the 6th form to drop Latin. And I was told, no, you can't drop Latin. You'll never be a doctor or a lawyer. I said, I don't want to be a doctor or lawyer. But no, I couldn't drop Latin. So I still had to continue my Latin studies.
You were established as a journalist in Trinidad by the time you were in your 20s. Did you have a wanderlust then? Did you feel the need to escape?
It was not so much a need to escape as that there was an inevitability about it. And I thought, since that, I don't think that my parents, who had led you on this education track, really thought that it meant that they would lose you in the end. And I thought that, my parents never really understood why I said I wanted to go to London. And they did come here and saw me, and occasionally they did think that I hadn't entirely messed up my life, but they were still puzzled about why I had taken this course. And I could never really, I suppose, fully explain it to them. It was never obvious that is where my life would lead me because of the way they had brought me up. They had, in fact, led me on this path, but yet they were quite surprised when I, in fact, embarked on it.
You had valuable years on the Strand at Bush House in BBC World Service. Then in the early 1970s, you got a job with ITN.
Yeah.
You were determined to say to them that you weren't coming just to be a blackface on the TV.
Yes, to be very honest with you, again, you know, I was probably, I talked a little too much. Before I left Trinidad, I had done some television. And so at Bush House, with my radio colleagues, I always told them in the bar on a Friday night that I was somehow a little better than they were because they had only done radio, but I had done some television. And they got really fed up with this, and they said, you know, if you think you are so good at television, there's this new place called ITN. Why don't you go and see them and see whether... And I actually did. I wrote to ITN, and I was quite shocked when they kind of dangled a job, you know, and I remember saying, you know, I said, I was so really surprised. I said, can I go away and think about it? And when I went back to Bush House, they said, how did it go? Thinking I had failed miserably. And I said, well, I was offered a job. And they said, when are you leaving? I said, no. I said I needed some time to think about it. They said, you so-and-so, pick up the phone now and ring them and tell them you accept. And I was rather worried about why I was being given this job. And I didn't want to be their token black reporter. You know, that was not the role I had seen myself as fulfilling in life. And I wanted to do everything that everybody else did. It had some disadvantages. One of the first jobs I did was I was sent in the early years of my TV reporting to Northern Ireland. And as I said, this was in the terrible, terrible days. And I'm a coward. I hate violence. I hate the sound of guns. I couldn't spell Kalashnikov. I hated the sound of bombs going off. Whenever they did, I ran a mile away. You know, so I'm a real coward. So it was very strange that I was sent there. But I wanted to do that because I wanted to do it because everybody else was doing it. And I didn't want to just cover stories on immigration or immigrants, or I wanted to be a thorough-going reporter. I must say I have no evidence that ITN ever intended to make me the token black reporter. I had a chance to do everything that I wanted to do. I think, in fact, I was more lucky than many others. So, you know, I was given a good ride.
Let's bring in some more cricket. By 1976, you had been in England for some years. The Caribbean diaspora was here. Lots of people were trying to make their way. It wasn't always easy.
No.
And then Clive Lloyd turned up with that team in 1976, and Tony Greig, the England captain, had to grovel.
Yes, I know, yes. I got to know Tony Greig a little bit, and I think that I'm not sure he understood fully what a white South African would be thought of talking about a West Indian team groveling. I think he used the words unwisely, and I don't think. But that's not the way it was seen in the West Indies. So every time he went into bat, and Michael Holding was at the other end, they remembered what he said, and they had the best deliveries in store for him. So yes, it was. As I say, I don't think Greg really meant it in that way, but it didn't come across that way to West Indians.
And what did that team mean for West Indians in this country who were making their way? Because they were a great source of pride and inspiration.
It was a stupid thing to say. As I say, I don't think he meant it in a nasty way, but it was thought of as a very silly thing to say, and so they made him pay rather heavily for that.
When we were backstage, we could hear Roddy introducing you, and this litany of names came out, people who you have met, great and extraordinary people: Mandela, Saddam Hussein, Yasser Arafat, American presidents, Mrs. Thatcher. How do you cope with meeting these world figures? And how do you cope with it professionally but also sort of emotionally, I suppose?
Yes, some of the emotionally, some were a bit difficult. I was pretty terrified about the whole Saddam Hussein experience because they made it very uncomfortable for you. I remember one afternoon we were told after a week or so waiting, go back to your room, don't leave, and we'll give you a call. And I didn't like being spoken to like that. And I thought, nobody tells me to go to my room and wait. Anyway, I was in Baghdad, and that's what we had to do. And we went there, went and waited in my room for a few days, and then the call came and said, there's a car downstairs to take you. And we got into this car, and I tried everything to ask, where are we going? There was no reply. There was a major sitting in the driver's, next to the driver, and there was a private in the car. And so the major wouldn't answer me about where we were going at all. And then I sort of discovered that the driver had no idea where we were going, because we would turn up at a roundabout, huge roundabout in Baghdad's roads, and the driver would perceptibly slow down, and he would wait for the major to say which turning he should take. And as we got to the turning, and the driver slowed right down onto the roundabout, and the major would tap the dashboard and said, second on the right. And then we got to the, what was, it turned out to be a presidential guest house. And we were met by a very nice man who came out and said, and this was about 3:30 in the afternoon. And he said, impeccably dressed and very polite and very welcoming. And he said, what would you like for breakfast? And you know how people who speak English always think that people who don't understand the language well. So I said, no, you mean dinner? And he said, no, I mean breakfast. So I thought, oh, that means we're staying here the night. But that was the only indication that we were. And the only other thing I remember about that evening, which I laugh at today, is there was a dinner, huge table, with every variety of juice you could find in the world. And I thought, if I'm to spend the night in a house that I don't know where I am, my office has no idea where I am, I have no mobile telephone, I shall need something stronger than juice. So I said to the man, would you mind if I phoned up my hotel and got some whiskey sent around? And he said, no, that's absolutely fine. He said, all I have to do is to reconnect the telephones. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, when you came in, we cut the lines. And I thought, so I have no phone. This place has no phones. My office has no idea where I am. And I thought, Trevor, this is not a very wise course of action for a grown man to be. But then we eventually got there. And when I got to see the president, he came in, and there were about 6 or 7 people crowding the space where I was supposed to be talking to him. And I said, but, this is very uncomfortable. You're in my, you're in the area. So I got one minister aside, and I said, could you all just, give me some more space? And he said, you don't understand, do you? He said, we are all anxious to hear you talk to the president because we never hear him ask questions which he's made to answer. So there was not Prime Minister's question time in Baghdad in those days, or presidential question time. So all these ministers were crowding round to hear this interview. And I have one other rather boring story about this, but I remember it because it tells me how in your life, in this work, it never leaves you, you carry on. About 2 or 3 years ago, I was invited to a party in Knightsbridge because of somebody I'd met in Hong Kong, and they were leaving Hong Kong, and they came to a party. And I came out of this party having drunk quite a bit. And this large man came out and he said, "You don't remember me, do you?" And I said, "Look, I'm terribly sorry. I'm getting on a bit in age now, and my memory is not as it used to be. And in any case, I've had a lot of red wine to drink tonight, and that doesn't help my memory very much anymore." And he didn't smile, and I thought, these are two of my best jokes. and there's no response. And he said, and this is 2 or 3 years ago, or 3 or 4 years ago, he said, "I was your interpreter when you saw Saddam Hussein." And I thought, wow. In Knightsbridge? And I sobered up pretty quickly, and we had an interesting conversation. But he was a very interesting guy.
You've lived an extraordinary life.
Yeah, he did, yeah.
You've met some extraordinary people and done some extraordinary things. Now, this is a nasty question. Would you swap everything you have done for a maroon cap? Would you swap all that for a place in the middle order in Frank Worrell's Test team in the 1960s?
Yes. You know, it's one of the things I was so poor at playing cricket that I never saw myself in that role. I was always content to be a good fan. I love watching. I've been fortunate to be able to watch cricket all over the world, in India, in Pakistan, in Australia a lot. I covered the birth of the Kerry Packer era, so I saw a lot of that then. And of course, I begged and stolen my way into cricket grounds all over England in the past few years. I've always had friends who I could call up and say, "Is there any chance that I could get a seat at the Test match tomorrow?" And they've always been very, very helpful. So I've been very lucky, and I leave it at that. I don't want to bat for the West Indies. I was never that good.
We've got time for a couple of questions, if you're happy.
Sure.
Hello, Sir Trevor. As someone that grew up listening to you and watching you on the news, it's really good listening to you and watching you speak today.
Thank you.
I should also mention that you actually handed me my degree in 2009 at London South Bank University. So it's good seeing you. My question on cricket is, I was in Barbados in November watching the Test series of England versus the West Indies, a match which England actually won. And I want to know from your point of view, why do you feel the West Indies are not producing as good a team as we were used to seeing in the 70s, 80s and 90s these days?
Yeah, did you get that?
Yeah, so what's gone wrong with West Indian cricket? Why aren't they the force? Well, that's what he was saying.
What's wrong with it these days? How much time do you have?
We could do another 45 minutes on that.
Yeah, I know, yes.
What has gone wrong with West Indian cricket?
It's a good question. We ask ourselves this all the time. I tell you the one thing which I don't believe. People say everybody wants to play baseball or basketball, or the American influence, they say, is now much more profound than what used to be the British influence. I don't buy all of that, really. I mean, the game has just drifted away. People are doing other things. I think organizationally, these islands are struggling more now than they used to. Economically, in broad political terms, there are other preoccupations, and cricket doesn't have the same prominence that it did. I hope that changes, but it's it's your question is you could ask it among the hierarchy of West Indian cricketers, and they you know have a great deal of time trying to discover why. I really don't know, but I watch some of the games these days on the television, and it's not what it used to be. I don't think it is as important as it used to be. I think surviving the world economic problems and so on now are much more the preoccupations of people in the Caribbean. Cricket is not what it used to be.
So Trevor, thank you. You've had obviously a lifelong passion for cricket and a career that's been very involved with politics, and the two do sometimes interact with each other. I wondered what your take is on the current move to ostracize the Afghan national team because of the way that the Taliban regime treats the women and the fact that the women have no cricket. Do you see it as a parallel with apartheid in South Africa, or what?
So,
why do you have a view on the Afghan national cricket team and their ostracization because of their treatment of women?
Well, I mean, it goes beyond cricket. I have a terrible view of what the Taliban are doing to women in Afghanistan. And what just jumping ahead a bit, what I don't understand is how we were there for so long, spent so much money in trying to bring this country around. And then one afternoon, we left one afternoon, and the following afternoon the Taliban marched in, and young girls can't go to school anymore. I think it's dreadful. And I mean, the same thing applies to the as you say, their sports people. I think it's an appalling thing.
Afternoon, Sir Trevor. When I grew up, there were two batsmen that really caught my eye. One being Brian Lara, the way he dispatched even the greats of McGrath and Murali all over the park, and Sachin Tendulkar, whose longevity from 16 to 40 led to him winning the World Cup in his latter years. So my question for you is, who in your view is the greater batsman and why?
You ask a Trinidadian this?
Yeah, I know, yes, I know. Yeah, or ask a West Indian this, yes. I know, more trouble. It's a question of who you like, really. And we talked about Frank Worrell. I used to like Frank Worrell. But I saw Everton Weekes play and had a time some years ago, great time with him in Trinidad. I'm told by people who saw much more of him than I did that Gary Sobers was probably one of the best cricketers there was. Brian Lara, was another one. I was saying to somebody earlier on, I was invited once to a party at Brian Lara's house, and I didn't go. And my sister almost accused me of treason. She said, "How could you not turn up at Brian Lara's invitation?" I said, "Well, unfortunately, I had some work to do." My sister didn't think that was a good excuse. So, I think Gary Sobers was probably about the best accomplished cricketer I ever knew.
So, Trevor, in defence of West Indies Test cricket, the team won their last match in Australia. They won they drew a series in Pakistan last week. But the game's moved on. And what are your thoughts about the 100? And have you ever been to a match?
I've never been to 100. No, I have a problem with it because I don't see too much difference between that and the 2020. And as a sort of older generation of West Indian cricket followers, I still prefer the longer version of the game. I like watching Test cricket. And so, but I gather the 100 makes a bit of money for the guys. I have a lot of friends in the top echelons of cricket, and it seems to work, so good luck to them. It doesn't do much for me.
Sir Trevor, I've lived in Turks and Caicos, Providenciales, for 2 years, living and working. I was wondering, where would you recommend that you really love going on holiday in the Caribbean?
Oh, why would I like?
Where do you enjoy going and exploring for like leisure in the Caribbean yourself?
Yes, because it's warm. And I have now lived here longer than I lived in the Caribbean. And I am still trying to cope with winter. And when I get up in the morning and pull the curtains, and it's kind of semi-dark, and then about 3:30 in the afternoon it's dark, sometimes I discover that I haven't left my flat for days. No, I'm still struggling with the cold, and I love the warmth. The funny thing is that many people in the Caribbean, we love warmth, but we don't particularly care for the sun. So I was never one for sitting out in the sun. I would find a shady bit on the beach to shield myself from. But yeah, no, I'm afraid. So there's a West Indian poet who said something like, he said, I brought the sun in my blood and now it dies. I must move closer to the fire to bathe my limbs in flame. That's me.
A Pacific island that you
to go
on holiday to?
Well, I mean, I was born in Trinidad, but I love going to Barbados. I love Antigua. I love Grenada, where my father was born. No, I love the island.
Hi, Sir Trevor. I grew up watching you on television, and I saw you report on Mandela's release in South Africa. I just wondered what actually went through your head at that moment when you were reporting on his release from Robben Island.
Do you know, I'm very glad you asked that, because it's one of the most extraordinary things I think, I've ever done. In that I'd been to South Africa before he was released, and so I'd covered South Africa during the apartheid years. And I never saw how it was possible for one man change this. And so when I met him, the main question was, how on earth are you going to try to change this system? How is it possible? And in fact, on the night of his release, we were anchoring the program from Soweto, and I was interviewing Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and playing devil's advocate, I said to him, this guy Mandela is coming out, and everybody here is having, dancing and singing and having a great time. Might he be a disappointment? Might he not really fulfill all your wishes? And Desmond Tutu said to me, he said, man, this is no time to have doubts about it. Let's dance. and we ended News at 10 by having a dance on top of the flatbed truck. But I was astonished at how coal-minded Mandela was, and how conspicuously unbitter he was. I tried very hard to ask him about his hard times in prison. And he said, that's all in the past, he said. I said, but you must have been treated terribly, and they must have been, treating you terribly badly. Oh, no, that's all in the past. We must look ahead to the future. And in that apartheid South Africa, he saw very clearly the possibility of a government based on all the races of people. And I felt that was incredible for somebody who had spent 27 years behind bars in prison. How could he come out so conspicuously unbitter, as I said, and still wanting to really promote harmony and peace among people? I found it extraordinary. And 5 years after I met him for the first time, I went back when South Africa hosted the Rugby World Cup, which they won in the end. And I was sent out by ITN because they wanted to do a program about him before the World Cup. And that's why I was sent. And we went out, and we were in the room very early one morning, and he asked for the lights to be turned down. And we turned them down, and he said, could you turn them down a bit more? And after a bit, I said, Mr. President, if we turn these lights down more, they won't be able to see you or me. So, we have to have some lights. He said, yes, I'm terribly, terribly sorry. He said, but I have problems with my eyes. And he said it was caused by breaking rocks on Robben Island. It was the first time that he'd ever said anything about hardship. It was the first, this is 5 years after I first met him. And I felt it was an extraordinary man who would look ahead with such, no bitterness at all. But and I gather when he went into the office for the first time, obviously in the president's office, there were a lot of white South Africans. And he went around and saying, I'm begging you all to stay. I need the help of you all if I'm to make a success of this job. I've been very lucky in my life, and I've met a lot of people. He's one of those I've never forgotten. A most extraordinary man.
Trevor, we have to leave it there. We've run out of time, sadly. Thank you for your insight. Thank you for your time. It's been such a privilege to be here with you. Ladies and gentlemen, Sir Trevor McDonald.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Stanfords Travel Podcast. You can find us at stanfords.co.uk and follow us on social media at Stanfords Travel.